In preparation for the Challah class that I'll be teaching later, I wanted to show folks how to prepare the dough and how to then ferment it, and so you can have dough that's ready to shape when we do the class. What we're using here is the recipe for my challah by Maggie Glezer from Blessing of Bread. There's lots of other challah recipes. I have links to some of those in some of the files I've sent. This challah, as you'll see, uses a lot of eggs, some oil, very, very little water, but it ends up being really good. So what we're going to do is this. First, we start out by mixing, by essentially creating what's called a slurry, yeast slurry, where we mix the yeast, a little bit of the flour, and the water together and let it kind of bubble up. So we're going to do that first. That sits for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we come back and mix and add the rest of the ingredients. The amounts of materials that I'm mixing here are double because of how much dough I need for the exercise later in the day. So you'll probably be mixing half of the amounts of materials that I have here. And so I'll mention both amounts. So we're going to start out with flour. Normal recipe here, we're going to put half a cup, quarter cup, we're going to put about half a cup of flour. It doesn't have to be fully accurate. Take half a cup of flour. Take the yeast, which again for the regular recipe is 6 grams of yeast. Here we have 12, double. And then we take our water, and as you can see, very little water. It's about a quarter cup for the single recipe, half cup for the full, otherwise 120 grams. And we're going to pour that in there. And then we're going to just quickly whisk that up, make it into a bubbly sauce, and leave that to sit. I'm using instant yeast here. If you're using, you can see the soft instant yeast, which I buy in bulk. If you're using active dry yeast, it's particularly important to let the yeast sit with the water and some flour for a few minutes before it goes. So we're going to let that sit and be back in about 15 or 20 minutes to add the rest of the ingredients that you can. So about 15 minutes or so have passed by, and now we're going to, you can't see too much change to the slurry here, but the yeast and the flour have started interacting. Now we're going to add a bunch of the ingredients, and then the rest of the flour, the wet ingredients basically, and then a bunch of the flour at the end. First, what we'll do is we're going to whisk together the eggs. Again, 3 eggs in the regular recipe, 6 eggs here. Whisk. Good. We're going to add to that mixture a few other things. Salt. And again, in this recipe, the single recipe is 8 grams of salt. Here we're adding, for 1.5 teaspoons, here we're adding a tablespoon or 16 grams. I think what we'll do is we'll mix it. You probably can mix it straight into the slurry. I think what we'll do here is mix all these wet ingredients together and then add them all at once. All right, then we're going to add the oil. Again, in the regular recipe, and this is just regular vegetable oil. In the regular recipe, we're adding a quarter cup or 55 grams of oil. Here we're doubling it, so half cup. And then we are adding honey. You can use either granulated sugar or honey. Here's the famous first part. We're adding honey. I think this dish is a lot better with honey, but if for some reason you'd rather use granulated sugar, the recipe shows how you could do that as well. So again, in this case, we're adding a quarter cup to the regular recipe, half cup to this recipe of just regular honey. The recipe suggests, and sort of did this here, the recipe suggests an interesting idea where you can put the oil into the cup where you're doing the honey first and then add the honey. Dump that oil out, then add the honey, and the honey will slip right out of the cup, which I did a while ago here, so it's no longer slipping. And so we'll need to kind of scoop it out. And that will, a little bit chunky now, but it'll mix in with everything else. And that should be good enough. One more. All right, so we're going to whisk those ingredients together without spilling too much. You know, the honey is the thing that's kind of hardest to mix in. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to get it mixed in further with the dough. And then we're going to dump it, make sure everyone can see, dump it into the slurry. Make sure we're getting all the remnants of honey out of the bowl. You can sort of see the slurry. If you look closely, you can see it kind of bubbling up a little bit. More than it was. And so then we're whisking that. Again, challah obviously is an egg bread, so the eggs provide a lot of the liquid. This one has oil. If you want to make a par of challah, you need oil. If you don't, or if you're having a vegetarian meal or you don't care, challah can be really good with butter as opposed to oil. So that's another option. All right, so there we've got our liquid and a little bit of flour mixed together. And now we're going to add the remainder of our flour. The flour we're using here is a basic all-purpose flour, unbleached. And we add the flour basically all at once. So the total flour here for a single recipe would be 3.5 cups between what we added originally and what we've put in now. Here it's 7 cups because of doubling. So this is all-purpose flour. There's not really a need to use bread flour. This is unbleached, which is going to be better, though if what you have is regular bleached all-purpose flour, that's fine too. We could be using a stand mixer here. The recipe suggests not to because the dough is relatively stiff, relatively low percentage of water and egg and other liquid. But in this case, I think it's better. Let's just do it by hand and show how that would work. So we're going to try to get the dough going, mixing it with this wooden spoon. But pretty quickly here, we're going to stop with that and begin mixing with our hands, get it more together, and then I'll show you how to knead it to get it to the consistency that we want. All right, we're not going to do that yet. So while I'm doing this, you could tell that I measured all those ingredients in advance. I measured them all by weight on this scale you can see. As those who've heard these classes know, making bread like this, it's much easier and more accurate to bake, to cook and mix by weight than by volume. A cup of flour can have a very different weight depending on whether you push it down, what kind of flour it is, all kinds of circumstances. You'll notice that this dough is really sticky. Don't worry about it sticking to the hands. The temptation might be to add more flour to it, but I would urge you to fight that temptation because as this sits for a while, the flour you've got here will absorb the liquid, and as you knead it as well, it'll absorb the liquid, and you'll be dealing with a dough pretty soon that is not as sticky as what you see here. All right, so I'm going to take this out again. Enjoy the dough on my hands, not fight it. I'm going to pull out of this container what is remaining. And we're going to use this bowl later to let the dough rise as well, I think. So her suggestion is to, without losing dough, to put that in the sink and let it, so I'm just gonna set it aside there. And now we're gonna start kneading the dough. And you can see, I'm just gonna have faith that as I do this, all this junk that's between my fingers is gonna come off and, you know, add itself into the glob of dough, right? So the basic kneading, we're pushing down like that, turning it 90 degrees, pushing it down again, turning it 90 degrees, and so on. And as we go, trying to take the dough from the fingers and add that to the blob. I don't recall how long she suggests that you do this kneading, but you're going to want to do it until it's quite smooth and everything is fully incorporated and you get off your fingers what is on there now. Even if you do sometimes, I mean, I've made this dough with a mixer with no problem, but there is something fun, especially at the beginning, about working it with your hands. Get the dough off the hands method. Hard to describe the consistency of this dough. It's not at all floury. It really is, as she recommends in the recipe, kind of Play-Doh look. You know, it's not too firm, but it's not, you know, it's not like a liquidy sort of dough. I don't know what the exact percentage of water to liquid to flour is here, but sort of on the slightly drier side, but kind of in the middle. Not as dry as bagels, not as wet certainly as certain kinds of breads or ciabatta or things like that. All right, we'll use this to scrape up the remaining pieces of flour on the table. So you can see it really came together as a single blob. My hands are almost clean. So in terms of the consistency of the dough, how you can see, right? Clearly there's no kind of clumps of flour. It's very, very smooth and soft. And at this point, I think we're good. And we can set it aside. Now we're going to set this dough aside to rise, to do the first ferment in a bowl covered with plastic wrap. The length of time that takes is roughly 2 hours, but that will depend a bunch on how warm it is and some other factors. So you want to, really study the recipe and how much it's supposed to have expanded before you move on to the next phase. I'm going to rinse out the bowl. So I rinsed out that bowl. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean because we just had the flour in there before. What we want though is for the surface to be smooth enough that as the dough rises, it's not sort of hitting resistance from clumps of dough and things like that, but it can smoothly rise up as much as it is able to do. One general suggestion, her suggestion was to put that bowl put hot water in that bowl once we sort of went to lay this out on the counter, and I think that's right. We can talk later, but you really want to let water be your friend in dealing with dough and not try to, use a sponge right away and scrub it. I think that this bowl is going to be probably a little bit small for this. We may move it to a different container. So we're going to take it there though. Probably keep an eye on it, and we're going to cover it with plastic wrap, cover the overall bowl, not just the one. Again, anticipating that it's going to grow at least double in size, maybe more over the next few hours. I think it's probably better to use plastic wrap here than to use a towel or something like that, just to avoid the dough from drying out. If the surface of the dough dries out too much, then that'll also impede its ability to rise as much as it would. So there we have our challah dough. Again, this is enough dough to make 4, in the amount I made here, to make 4 1-pound challahs, or the equivalent of larger challahs. And we'll split this up later to use it for different purposes. As the recipe lays out, you can take this dough, put it into the fridge right away now, and take it out, again, calculating your time carefully, take it out anytime within the next 24 hours and use it to make challah. If you do that, you need to give yourself enough time that the dough can warm back up to room temperature. So we'll stop there and we'll put this up and see you later.